The roar of motorcycle engines echoed down the empty street, a sound of power, dominance, and fear. But then, in the midst of it all, a lone figure, unassuming, vulnerable, sat on the sidewalk. A man in a wheelchair, his dark skin shining under the harsh sun, staring ahead as the bikers circled him. "Hey, cripple! What are you doing here?" one of them sneered, revving his engine louder, mocking the man's stillness. Another biker laughed, pulling out his phone to record, eager to post the humiliation. But then, something changed. The man in the wheelchair slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out a phone of his own. The bikers, too focused on their mockery, didn't notice at first. But when he pressed a single button, the air grew thick with anticipation. And with that, the smirk on their faces began to fade. What came next would shake them to their core. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. James sat there, his wheelchair a silent testament to years of struggle and resilience. To the world, he was just another disabled man trying to survive in a world that often overlooked people like him. His clothes were simple: worn jeans, a faded t-shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days. But there was something about him, something that didn't quite fit the image they had already formed of him. The bikers who surrounded him didn't know this. They saw only weakness, only a target for their cruel amusement. They didn't know that beneath the surface, James carried something they couldn't even fathom. As the laughter continued, James's gaze never wavered. He was calm, almost detached, his face a mask of serenity, yet the tension in his eyes spoke of a storm waiting to erupt. He had been underestimated his whole life, pushed aside by a world that couldn't see beyond his disability and the color of his skin. But today, something was different. Today, the world would finally see him for who he truly was. And the bikers, they would regret ever underestimating him. "What's the matter, boy? Cat got your tongue?" one of the bikers taunted, revving his engine so loud it shook the ground beneath James's feet. The others laughed, their faces twisted with amusement, clearly enjoying the sight of a man who, to them, was nothing more than a joke. But the laughter wasn't just about mocking his disability. It was about something deeper, a shared belief that a man like James, black and disabled, didn't belong in their world. They saw him as a lesser being, someone who didn't have the right to take up space, to exist freely. And in this moment, they decided they would remind him of that. "Bet you're scared of us, huh?" Another biker jeered, getting closer, the smell of gasoline and leather overpowering. "What are you gonna do? Call the cops? You think they'll help you? You're nothing but a freak." James's hands tightened around the wheels of his chair, but he didn't flinch. He knew they were trying to provoke him, to get him to react in anger, to give them the satisfaction they craved. But James had learned long ago that anger was a trap. No, he wouldn't give them that. Instead, he would show them something much worse, something they hadn't bargained for. And just as the tension peaked, with one biker lunging forward, ready to push James off the sidewalk, the phone in his hand buzzed. A simple notification, but one that would change everything. James's fingers brushed across the screen of his phone, almost too calmly for anyone to notice. The bikers, still jeering, hadn't yet realized the significance of his silence, mistaking it for fear. But in reality, James wasn't afraid. He was biding his time, waiting for the exact moment to expose the truth. For years, he had been a shadow, a figure in the background, ignored and underestimated by those who couldn't see past the surface. But they didn't know who James really was. They didn't know the circles he ran in, the doors he could open with a simple call. To them, he was just a helpless man in a chair. To him, they were nothing more than a pack of wolves lost in their arrogance. His thumb hovered over the screen, the phone vibrating with the incoming call. His expression didn't change, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the person on the other side of the line. With a steady breath, James tapped the screen, and as the call connected, the atmosphere shifted. The bikers, still oblivious, laughed among themselves, unaware of the impending storm. They didn't know that this call was about to expose everything they thought they knew about the man in the wheelchair. The first word he spoke into the phone was calm, yet carried the weight of something far greater than they could ever imagine. "It's time." The bikers paused for a brief moment as James's calm voice echoed into the phone, the stillness hanging in the air like a warning. The one closest to him leaned in, squinting at the phone in James's hand as if he could somehow figure out who was on the other end by sheer force of will. But they had no idea. They couldn't have known that James wasn't just any man on the street. They hadn't done their homework. They hadn't realized that he wasn't the kind of person you crossed without consequences. As James spoke, his words were measured, precise, as though he was laying out the beginning of a plan, one the bikers would soon regret dismissing. The laughter that once filled the air now faded, replaced by a nervous tension. One of the bikers, trying to brush off the unease, scoffed and revved his engine again, but the smile had already faded from his face. "Who do you think you're calling, huh?" the biker sneered. "Ain't nobody gonna help you." But James didn't respond. He was too focused. He was already gathering information, mentally mapping out the connections, the faces, the names. As the seconds ticked by, the suspense grew thicker, and the bikers couldn't help but feel the shift. The realization that something was about to go terribly wrong for them. The phone call continued, and James's next words were like a key unlocking a door. The biker's grin faltered. His confidence cracked. He had no idea who James had reached out to, but the way James was speaking, the certainty in his voice, it was as though the world was now on James's side, and that, more than anything, was enough to make the bikers start to question their decisions. Then the chilling line came, whispered under his breath but heard by everyone. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The words hung in the air, heavy with a promise of something none of the bikers were ready for. The laughter that had once filled the street was now replaced with silence, a deep, unsettling quiet that crawled under their skin. James didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stared ahead, the phone pressed to his ear, as though the next moment was already written in stone. One of the bikers, trying to regain his swagger, took a step forward. "What's the matter? You think you're some kind of big shot?" he sneered, his voice shaking ever so slightly. But before he could take another step, a distant sound reached their ears. Sirens, growing louder with each passing second. At first, the bikers dismissed it, convinced it was just a coincidence. But the closer the sirens grew, the more they began to feel that familiar rush of panic. They looked around, unsure of what was happening, but still convinced that they were untouchable. James, however, didn't seem concerned. His gaze never wavered. The sirens grew deafening, and just as they were on the verge of turning tail, a black SUV rounded the corner, screeching to a halt in front of them. The door swung open, and a tall figure stepped out, dressed in a sharp suit, his presence commanding the street. The bikers froze, eyes widening in disbelief as the man walked toward James. The man wasn't just anyone. He was a high-ranking officer, someone they all knew by reputation, someone with connections that went far beyond their petty world of bullying and intimidation. Without a word, the officer acknowledged James with a nod, his face expressionless but filled with an unspoken understanding. The bikers now stood on the edge of a cliff, realizing, far too late, the mistake they had made. James's voice, calm and steady, cut through the tense silence. "You thought I was just a guy in a wheelchair." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. "But you were wrong. You never bothered to look deeper, never asked the right questions." The bikers stood frozen, their faces pale as the officer stepped forward, the situation now completely out of their control. And as they looked from James to the officer, they realized the truth in James's words. They had underestimated him, and now they were going to pay the price. The air was thick with tension as the officer's presence loomed over the bikers. The situation, once filled with their taunts and laughter, had now turned completely in James's favor. The realization hit them all at once. They weren't the ones in control anymore. The officer, with a single nod, signaled the bikers to step back. James didn't need to say another word. He had already made his point. The bikers, now pale and visibly shaken, knew they had crossed a line they couldn't undo. They muttered among themselves, their bravado completely gone, before one by one they climbed back onto their motorcycles and sped away, their engines roaring like fading thunder. The street was silent once more, save for the distant hum of the sirens. James, still sitting in his wheelchair, let out a quiet breath, his expression calm as ever. He had been through enough to know that these moments didn't come often, when an underdog, someone overlooked, could finally stand tall and prove that strength came in many forms. The officer, who had been standing by his side, turned to him with a respectful nod. "You sure know how to handle yourself," he said, his voice softer now, less authoritative but full of recognition. "You could have handled this a lot differently, but you chose the high road." James smiled slightly, his eyes reflecting a quiet wisdom. "Sometimes, the best way to fight is by not fighting at all," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had lived through far more than others could imagine. As the officer walked away, leaving James alone on the quiet street, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the pavement. James looked around, the world now a little quieter, a little kinder. He had shown the bikers who he truly was. Not just a man in a wheelchair, not just a target, but someone with power, with connections, and with the strength to overcome anything. The morale was clear, echoing in the fading light. Never judge someone based on appearances. The strongest warriors often fight battles we can't see, and the greatest victories come when we show the world the strength hidden within. As the screen fades to black, the final words echo in the minds of the viewers. Never judge someone based on appearances. The strongest warriors often fight battles we can't see, and the greatest victories come when we show the world the strength hidden within. The Justice Twist delivers once again, reminding us all that true strength is not always visible on the surface.